Let's begin with a prayer. I've lit my votive candle. I hope you've done the same. Heavenly King and Comforter, the Spirit of truth, everywhere present, filling all things, the treasure of blessings and giver of life. Come and dwell in us. Cleanse us of every stain and save our souls, O gracious one. Tonight's special guest really doesn't need an introduction, but for those of you who have not seen her or heard her before, I think it bears mentioning. Dr. Євгенія Константіну holds 5 degrees in theology, including Master of Theology degrees from Holy Cross, Harvard Divinity, and a PhD from Université Laval, where she specialized in the apocalypse in the ancient church. She has been a professor at Orthodox institutions, including Holy Cross, the Patriarch Athenagoras Institute, and for the past 18 years, she has taught biblical studies and early Christianity at the University of San Diego, and she also currently teaches New Testament at 2 graduate schools, the Franciscan School of Theology and Saints Athanasius and Cyril Coptic School of Theology. She's been a regular speaker and author at many retreats over 40 years. Her recent book we just covered was Thinking Orthodox, Understanding and Acquiring an Orthodox Christian Mind. Good evening, Jeannie. Welcome to the program. And
Yes.
we're talking about the fact that the apostles had doubt, not just Thomas.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, the last time we talked about doubt, you mentioned the apostles doubted and not just Thomas. Can you quickly remind us a little bit about how they actually doubted?
Well, I'll tell you how we know that they doubted. We know because the Bible tells us. The Bible is very honest. You know, I think this is one reason why I'm a little puzzled when people are so doubtful about the Bible. It tells us things that aren't always putting people, the big heroes of the Bible, in the most flattering light. So the Bible does tell us, besides the famous episode with Thomas, at the end of chapter 28, when the Lord was sending out the apostles, what we call that the Great Commission. Mm-hmm. And he said, go out, to all nations, baptize them and teach them. And it said that the apostles were on this mountain with the Lord and they worshiped him, but some doubted. So that's more than one. We don't know who they were, and maybe it's better that way. But the point is that they were real people too, and they had to struggle with this. They had to come to understand the Lord and who he was. And in some ways, that was more difficult for them. And I had never thought about that because we like to think, well, if we saw these miracles, we would just believe. But, not necessarily, because they had a different relationship with him. We've never had that intimate physical companionship with Christ the way they did. And St. Ambrose said that it was harder for them to believe because they knew him as a physical man, and he looked most of the time just like any one of us. Right. And so that was very difficult for them to worship him. So they had their own challenges to overcome in the area of faith and doubt. Mm-hmm.
And, it said some doubted. Yes. But he did say at the end, I am with you until the close of the age, right?
That's right. And they all grew, of course.
He put those parentheses there for us.
That's right. They doubted, but he didn't say, get away from me and don't start your mission until you've resolved everything, right? That's really important. He understood that. We see that with Thomas too. With Thomas, he doesn't say, Thomas, how dare you doubt the resurrection? Right. He knows that Thomas needs some kind of, we could say, proof or reassurance. So he says, come over here, put your hand here, look at my wounds, go ahead, if that's what you need. So I think that, I don't know what it is about us, but we tend to think that he must have been scolding Thomas, but I don't think that's true at all. I think that the Lord understands our weakness and he accepts us at whatever level we are.
No, that's a very important point. Yeah, that's an important point.
We're not all giants of faith. We're not born that way. We have to grow into it, but God helps us if we are willing to walk with him and take those steps. And you could look at so many people. The only people who are really great, the great giants of faith, of course, is Abraham. But look at Moses. Moses didn't want to go to Egypt. Right. He was doubting. He was coming up with all kinds of excuses. Gideon, the same thing. So we don't have perfect people in the Bible, and God doesn't expect us to be perfect. So we should, if we have moments of doubt, we should cut ourselves a break and not think that there's something wrong with us that can't be remedied in time.
Mhm.
Patience.
And I think a lot of people today doubt more, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
With the news cycles that we have, we see, if you watch news often,
Yes.
it's one calamity
Yes,
after another.
Yes.
And the media usually says, they don't say this publicly, but if it bleeds, it leads. So anything
Yes.
that is catastrophic has to
Right.
be in front. Well, the person
Right.
who's absorbing that,
Yes.
saying, oh my, where is the Lord here?
Yes.
I mean, just
yes.
example, this evening, I was watching the news before we got on, and I'm seeing the subways in New York. I'm seeing the apartment buildings in Philadelphia. I'm seeing the bridges in Tennessee, the flooding, the people. And I'm saying, come on, Lord, what's going on here? So the doubt, I think, is a very real part of our lives. But I believe we're in a doubt assault, if that's an appropriate word. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think it's a great word, because we are sort of overwhelmed, and this affects us in a lot of ways, you know, because sometimes we have we receive requests for donations for all kinds of different things. Well, it used to be, let's think a long time ago, like in the time of St. John Chrysostom, you know, you might hear about a famine far away, but mostly the poor people were right there in your neighborhood, so you help them. Now we hear about every tragedy, and everybody's asking us to contribute, and it's a very overwhelming feeling, and it can kind of lead to a sort of paralysis. So we have to recognize when that is happening and turn it off for a while, and just, you know, or go say a prayer. We can't solve everything. We can't help everybody, but we can certainly pray for them. And that's a big help. We have to accept the fact that that in itself is a help, not to minimize any financial contribution or other kind of help that we can give, and we should do that as much as we can also. But you make a very good point, Father, that sometimes this can be really overwhelming and makes us think that the world is falling to pieces. Yeah. But that's because we didn't have access to that much information before. And you're right, it sells, right? Bad news sells. Yeah. And so that's what they feed us. They give us a little token inspirational story sometimes at the end of the news.
Yeah, a little pop-up.
That's a little happy story at the end, but we don't get that very often.
No, we don't. True. And I think one of the biggest stories last week, of course, was the ending of the war in Afghanistan. Yeah. Whether you agree with it or disagree with what happened, over 100,000 people were airlifted, the largest airlift in history, out of the country. But hundreds of thousands of people now are devastated. Where are they going to go? Where are they going to live? You know, these are all issues. These are real issues. Right. And we can only imagine. Now you can say, well, they're not Christian, they're Muslim or whatever, but they're still human beings. Yeah,
they're suffering a lot.
They're suffering a lot. What kind of doubts must be in their heads, right? So
I'm thinking, like, of course, I'm sure you have, a lot of us, maybe everybody here in this feed has been praying for Afghanistan. I just pray, I pray that they find some comfort, and I also pray that they find the light of Christ, because they're suffering a lot, and part of it has to do with the ideology. That's not their fault. This is how they were raised. This is what they believe. This is what they know. But Christ is capable of doing a lot of things to everyone. And he is the one who is the light of the world. And so he came to bring light to the world. And he is the one who illumines every person coming into the world. So we can pray, and that's not a racist thing or a bigoted thing, to pray for the light of Christ in those people, because that's what St. John said, and we have that phrasing in our prayers too, don't we? Yes. That who illuminates every person coming into the world. Yes. Yeah. It's said even at the baptism, as we know too, when we wash the person clean. I'm also, before we go back to that issue, I'm also thinking of the young soldiers, 20,000, of course, that were wounded. 3,000 that were killed, especially the last 13. Those innocent young people, if you watch them, Yes.
Talk about doubt. I mean, I didn't see any doubt in them. They were lifting babies over fences, barbed wire fences. They were reaching down. They were literally patting down people to make sure they had no bombs on them. I mean, these young people, I didn't see an ounce of doubt in them. They were heroes.
You know that famous saying, there are no atheists in foxholes.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
among the soldiers, among the people of the highest level of faith are soldiers and policemen, people who really, firefighters, really put their lives on the line every day. And they're people of prayer because they really rely on God. And I think that that's something that we become very complacent because we don't think about death every day.
Absolutely.
But they do. And so this is a lesson that we can learn from them. And to the extent that they were unjustly killed in those last 13, especially, I can't imagine being one of the parents of those last 13 who were killed.
Terrible.
You know, and even though there's some consolation that they were doing what they loved and they volunteered for this and they wanted to help and they did help people, they're like martyrs because they died to help others. So they're an example. And
ultimate sacrifice.
Yeah, it really is. Really, really is.
Let me ask you this, Jeannie. I mean, why do you think that even the apostles themselves doubted sometimes? Yes. What is it that, in your studies and in your work that you've been able to come up with there?
Well, because there was such incongruity in their experience of Jesus Christ. We've never known Jesus, and we know theologically that he's human, but we never experienced him as a human being. But they saw him as a regular human being, and then he would do these amazing things that they couldn't explain. And I love those gospel stories where, for example, he's stilling the storm, and so he's asleep, right? He's exhausted, like any human being. And think of all of the sheer energy that Christ expended because of the thousands and thousands of people who were always around him, who always wanted something, who were reaching out to touch him and his robes. And the people, imagine if you had somebody in your family who was sick, what lengths you would go to find Jesus and then try to reach him. So, and he was here ministering to all these people. That's exhausting. So he gets on the boat right away, falls asleep. And then this big storm comes up and he's sleeping. Then, so he's a human being and he looks just like any one of us in his humanity. And then they say, wake up, we're perishing, master. So he gets up and he's like, stop. And then stops.
Right.
And then what is their reaction? They're astonished. What did they say? They said, what sort of man is this? Right. And so they had to deal with that. They experienced him in two very different ways that they were not able to bring together. And being Jews, strict monotheists, they never heard of God having a son. So it was a lot for them to absorb. We're really lucky because we don't have to figure these things out. The church already took care of that for us. But they had to figure these things out as well. It was difficult. I think they're talk about heroes. They're really heroes in their own right because they had to suspend a lot of notions that they had and accept something so new and so revolutionary. And that did require faith. There was a real leap of faith for these people who were committed Jews to accept this idea that God even had a son.
Yeah,
okay, so the whole idea of Trinity is like just very difficult.
We don't think of that. That's a good point. Well, folks, I want to give you the opportunity also to ask questions of Dr. Jeannie. So you can put your thoughts and your comments, questions preferably, into the chat room, and Noel will get them for you. We also, of course, are people on social media, and they will offer the questions there, and then we'll sort of put them in like we always do in the course of our discussion. When the apostles preached about Jesus, most people did not accept the message right away. I mean, why not? What were some of the reasons that people doubted during those first centuries? Because these weren't peaceful times.
No, that's for sure. They were brutal times. And then we talk about all these things that are happening right now that you mentioned, all the tragedies, and we think we're living in the worst times. Actually, we're living in the best times. Because if you imagine the brutality that was around, it was part of people's everyday lives, not just natural disasters, but real brutality, real hardship. So it wasn't easy for people to believe in Jesus. And people sometimes think, oh yeah, they just believed it because everybody was a simpleton and somebody talked about Jesus and they just believed it. Actually, they didn't. It was very difficult. If they were Jewish, of course, they had to accept the idea that the Messiah died on a cross. And today, that is still the number one reason why Jews do not accept Jesus. So the whole idea of a suffering Messiah who dies in the most shameful manner, because the general idea is still alive in Judaism, definitely reinforced a lot in the Old Testament, is that if something bad happens to you, God is punishing you for something. That's throughout almost everywhere in the Old Testament, okay? So Jesus overcomes that. The teachings of Christ are not like that. But this idea that if you're good, God blesses you, and if you're bad, God punishes you, that's everywhere in the Old Testament. So there's nothing worse that can happen to you than to be crucified. So as far as they're concerned, that's proof that Jesus was cursed by God, that Jesus is a false prophet, that, so this was very difficult for the Jews. So most of them did not believe. For the pagans, the very idea of a God becoming a human being and then dying on the cross, that was so ridiculous. To worship a crucified person was laughable. They ridiculed Christians. So it was not easy. Again, all of that required faith to believe that they would say things like, if Jesus was a God, he would be born a king. That made sense to the Roman mind. That made sense to the Greek mind. He wouldn't be born a poor Jewish rabbi and then die on a cross. That makes no sense. So that should help us to understand that we can only approach God in faith. We can never demand proof of anything, because our whole faith, our whole religion is founded on this idea that you can only come to God through faith. And he chose the cross as the means of salvation for that very reason, because it requires faith. So it was very, very difficult for the church to make inroads. And so with the crucifixion, the incarnation, the resurrection, they said Jesus was crazy. Or some people said he's not a God, he's just a human. But some of them were able to accept that he was a human. He was a God, but not a human. Others said he was a human and not a God. He was a false prophet. Of course, the Jews said he did his miracles by trickery and things like that. So it wasn't easy for the church at all.
No. And, I keep thinking of, Archbishop Christodolos, the former Archbishop of Greece. He came to America. He actually came to Miami. We had the opportunity to be with him during his time of surgery and attempts to save his life because he was suffering from cancer. And he came to our parish. And I remember when people saw him, they all stood up. They were just shocked that he would be there. He was really a lightning figure at the time and an incredible speaker. And he used from the scripture the word tharsite, be at peace, I think you would say.
Courage, yeah.
Have courage.
Courage.
And people were saying, how does this man, tharsite, how can you have courage when you are going to die? Yeah. And he said, look, I can do that because I have no doubt in my mind that which I've been preaching and living my whole life is actually part of who we are and where we're headed. So, what you said about the issue of crucifixion, I mean, crucifixion was, to my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, one of the worst and the most degrading forms of execution at the time.
It's horrible. It was always considered the very worst punishment, summa supplicia. And I've been doing a lot of work on that because my next book is about the crucifixion.
There you go.
So it's horrible in a way we can't even begin to imagine. I mean, we kind of understand how terrible it was, but it was not just extremely painful beyond description, which is where we get our word excruciating from.
Excruciating,
pain is actually comes from out of the cross. Pain beyond imagination, okay? But it's more than that. It was the social stigma, the humiliation, the degradation. This is what people feared not only the pain, but the loss of social status, of honors, which was very important in that culture. We don't really comprehend it. We get embarrassed. We don't want people to think ill of us, but it's nothing like the Roman Empire, when the most important thing was honor and glory and people respecting you. And to die like that, you know, was considered the worst thing, because you died without honor. And that was something that was very, you know, and so for the idea that you would worship somebody, they literally thought Christians were insane. They really did.
Tell me the word tharsite, be of courage.
Yeah.
Do you know off the top of your head where that comes from? If not, we'll look it up.
Yeah, there. You know what? I would say.
Was it when he was on the boat then?
No, he doesn't. I'm not thinking as much about.
We'll look it up.
Jesus say it. I know that he says to Paul to have courage, but I'm not sure if that's the word, because I'm usually reading the Bible in English. Unless I'm doing some kind of a study, then I'll see that.
Okay, well, we'll look it up.
Yeah, please do. But he does tell them, oh, of course he says, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And that kind of a thing. I think he might also have said that at the very end when he says, when he's preparing them for his arrest and crucifixion, and in John. So, because you read the gospel, I'm sure, Father, in Greek in church.
Yes.
So, are you thinking about that at the end of the final farewell discourse when he says?
I have to look at, because
don't be afraid. I have conquered the world. I think he says take courage.
Yeah, I think that's where it is. I think that's where it is, because that word, you know, that word has always stuck in my head, especially once the Archbishop, his presence was there. I mean, I was with him for 4 weeks, day in and day out. And it was an incredible experience. And just his courage, just, you know, he cried, but he didn't doubt. He didn't doubt.
Right.
And as we do, we all cry, we worry, we're concerned we're human beings. Of course, we're going to be concerned. All right, let's go to our listeners and our viewers and see if we have any questions there. Noel?
So we have a question from Brian, which is, what is despondency and is it similar to doubt?
Well, the person who there's a book called on, you know, faith and despondency, and it's by an Orthodox author. So if you're interested in that, you should look into that. That's published by Ancient Faith Press. She also has a podcast about that. That's not exactly my field, but despondency is different than doubt, because despondency is more like despair, where we feel like we can't possibly be saved. And there is a lot of that in the culture too. So when I think about doubt, I'm thinking more in terms of God's existence, and that's what we're talking about here. But despondency is more discouragement, but kind of worse than just ordinary discouragement, something that the devil uses to try to draw us away. So that's not a good thing, right? But it is different than doubt, because doubt is more like intellectual, more in your head. And despondency, I would think, is more in your heart. Father, maybe you could.
Yeah, I think it's a psychological issue there too. I think it goes beyond just the day-to-day situations and things. When you become despondent, you have just one thing on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, and it creates a wall. And so our faith teaches us that doesn't necessarily, we can be despondent, we can lose hope, but we can't lose the faith that we have in Christ, that all things are possible through him who believes. So if you start pulling the bricks down, you get rid of the wall of despondency. I think that's how we look at it. Okay. Another one, Noel, do we have any others?
Yeah, one more question, which is, so some people grew up in a home or in a faith community where doubting was not allowed, shamed. And we've talked a lot about overcoming our doubts, but what about people who are struggling to overcome shame about their doubts or an inability to communicate their doubts?
That's why we started by talking about how even the apostles doubted. And that's why we're having this conversation, because we want this to come to light. We want people to know that that can be a very normal thing. They shouldn't be ashamed of it. It's difficult to confess that, but you should know that even the apostles doubted, and not just Thomas, and it took them time to grow in faith. We just have to accept the fact that we just don't become giants of faith immediately. We want to believe, and so we should pray, and we should live our lives as people of prayer and people of faith. And when the doubts come to our minds, just keep on going to church, pray to God, and usually that it goes away. But you shouldn't feel shame over it, but I know it's natural because we are embarrassed. I know I was, okay? So we are embarrassed to admit that we have doubts. So since I'm on the other side of that now, I'm not as embarrassed, but I did go through that for a long time. It wasn't easy, and I was a presbytera, okay? So, I'm in church, and these thoughts would come to my mind is, but does God really exist? Now, I also identified that this is the devil talking to me and trying to convince me, my rational self, okay? So we also have to recognize that happens, that these thoughts come from the devil. And so those thoughts would come to my mind, and it was embarrassing for me. I never told anybody about that, except for my spiritual father. Otherwise, I never told anybody. So you don't have to, but just know that you shouldn't feel shame about it. Just confess it, ask God to give you his light and his grace, and tell the devil to go away. Okay.
Take a hike, right?
Get lost. Go to hell. Go to hell where you belong.
You
can tell him to go to hell. We can tell him to go to hell.
Go back to your house.
Go
I have to confess to you that seeing a lot of this reality TV and people going on television and talking about the difficulties in their life,
yes,
and exposing all that to the whole world, I don't know if that's what we should be doing as Orthodox Christians. I believe we should develop a relationship with our spiritual father, who happens to be our parish priest, and you go to him and you work through the issues.
Yes.
By going on television and saying all the things you're doing in your life, I don't think that adds one iota to your salvation. I don't know. What do you think, Krista?
Of course not. And then sharing everything on social media, all of these things are distractions, and they're very much about the ego. Whether it's something great that you think you've done or you think you are, or whether it's, oh, poor me, it's still all about me. Right. So unfortunately, we live in this culture where we are very self-centered, and we can't possibly be saved like that. So yeah, I agree with you, Father. We need to stay away from that sort of thing.
Yeah, big time. Noelle, any others, or should I go back to some of my questions?
Go back to your questions, Father Chris, but I just wanted to say I really like that point that you made about social media, because I think whether in real life or in social media, the temptation to live a life that's performative is very very connected to sort of the lack of spiritual development, and maybe even leads to doubt. I think when you stop actually participating and start just performing, that's when I find that more doubts creep in and more fear. So
right,
and go ahead, Judy.
No, Father, please go ahead.
And I know a lot of young people use social media to communicate with one another, and that the social media activity, if you will, their life pattern, becomes very destructive, because they begin to go after the image of who they are.
That's right.
Their hair, their weight, their size of their eyes, their nose, their lips. I mean, all things that are really ridiculous. And yet people just want to be there so that they can receive the
likes,
approval, the likes, very dangerous stuff there. Very
dangerous. Very dangerous. Very dangerous and very damaging for young people. They get sucked into this, and they kind of believe what others are presenting about their lives. Everybody's life looks better than yours. Mine is so ordinary. And, we have to be so careful about that. And cultivating a false image, because that really is hypocrisy, isn't it? Isn't that what the Lord condemned the Pharisees for their hypocrisy? So we don't want to try to present an image of ourselves, that's false. That doesn't also means, like Father said, you're not supposed to spill your guts, tell everybody what you've done that's wrong. Right. We need to cultivate again the sense of privacy that has been lost. Everybody feels like, and part of that is the idea of fame. Remember Andy Warhol? Everybody will be famous for 15 minutes. Boy, was Was he right?
Was he right?
People are chasing fame because they think that this will make them happy, but they're really very empty. And all you have to do is look at the lives of so many famous people to see how empty and how sad, and people who seem to have everything committing suicide. Just tragic. That's not where we're going to find peace. We find peace through Jesus Christ, but that's harder. We don't get the instant gratification that we get by posting something on the internet to show where we traveled on vacation, or how much weight I've lost, or how beautiful my baby is, and all these other things. So we have to be guarding ourselves against that. We have to
there's really the two S's that I've heard of before. There's the sacred, and there's the spectacular. And I think I've said it at other programs before. We live in a world that worships the spectacular.
Yes.
And we have forgotten that we are the repository of that which is sacred, and
That's
that
right.
which gives abundant life. And we have to sort of switch the pendulum back to the sacred and not necessarily be so excited with the spectacular, because like you said, everybody gets 15 minutes of fame and then poof, out the window it goes.
There's a couple of things. We're like the grass, like the flower of the field that blooms and then it fades. So, we have to recognize that we are, like, I love what you said, Father, we are the sacred. We are treasures in earthen vessels. And the person next to you who may look very ordinary, who drives a beat up car, gets their clothes at the Goodwill, that person could be a saint.
That's right.
And you're busy trying to impress somebody by going out to, lease a BMW that you can't afford or something like that. For what? It's all shallowness. It's all ephemeral. Okay, ephemeral. Okay, it's all nothing, because we are dust. We are dust, and we have to accept that. We have to remember that. We have to remember that what we see, every human person is not their who they are, their value in the eyes of God, have nothing to do with what they look like, where they live, how much money they have, what car they drive. And we have to be so careful, because our culture is trying to promote this. You have to have this, you have to look like that, your house has to be perfect, you've got to be Martha Stewart and J-Lo and all these, and you have to be famous, otherwise you don't count. You don't matter.
Nice people, but I don't know what they're going to add to one iota to our salvation, right?
No, but the point is, you have to remember that but they are not even who they say they are. And
That's
even
correct.
with the pictures you see in magazines, the girls become so obsessed about these beautiful, they're all retouched. They've taken somebody's neck and made it longer, and their waist is smaller. Even the celebrities don't look that good in real life.
Right.
You've probably seen some, and I have too, because I live in Southern California. They don't look like that.
They don't look like that, huh?
They don't.
Oh boy.
Oh,
you've just crushed me. Okay. All right. Let's.
Father, in South Florida, you got to have.
Oh, we've got it here. We got everybody sucked in with the here. You could see the cheeks and the what are these called? The cheekbones and the chins. And everything's pushed back, so the eyeballs are almost popping out of the head like an alien.
Yeah,
but look, people have bought
true.
into this. People have bought into this, and it's not that people are bad that do these things. So we don't want to give that impression.
No.
But what we're trying to do here, folks, is to say, please swing the pendulum from the spectacular to the sacred. Get off the reality stage. And get back into the gospel, because that's where you find the truth.
It's superficiality that is being presented, and
absolutely,
an image.
So, folks, please, if you have questions, I see a couple more popping up. I have a question I'm going to ask Jeannie now, and then we'll come back to those questions. So, if you have them, please put them in the chat, or if you're on Facebook, let Noel know what they are, and then we'll move forward. Cristela, what do you think are the main obstacles that people of faith face today?
I think that the main thing for us is that we live in a culture that emphasizes the use of the rational mind, whether it's for people of faith or people maybe who don't have faith. We feel like we should be able to understand everything and explain everything, and that's not true. So I think that that's a big challenge. I think also that sometimes for people who are of faith, people in the church, sometimes we have kind of unrealistic expectations of what the church ought to be doing, and then we find fault with it, or with people in the church. People sometimes disappoint us, sometimes the faithful in the pew, sometimes the priest, sometimes the bishop disappoint us, and then we sort of feel like things shouldn't be like that. So that can also cause us to fall away. And you had mentioned, I think in the last program, Father, you mentioned that the story of Saint Nectarios. And I saw your interview, by the way, with the author who the actor who played him. And, you know, the church is not perfect, and the people in the church are not perfect. And we have to struggle sometimes to come to church, even when we don't like everything. Things are not perfect. Yeah. So we have to accept that. And that's an opportunity for us. We have to look at that, not be looking at them and say, but they said this to me, or Father, I can't stand it. Here he is. He's talking about that again, or whatever it is. We have to see this as an opportunity for us to change ourselves and how we respond to those people, because the problem is not them. The problem is us. Even though they're doing something wrong, the problem is us, because we have to learn to love them. And if we don't love them in spite of everything that they're doing, then we are not going to be saved. And that's the example there that Saint Nectarios gave in his life, praying for and forgiving and loving the people who persecuted him, who were the hierarchs of the church. So very often, this is really, truly incredible. So this is something that I think the expectations, and also the ideas that, you mentioned this already, Father, having these false expectations or false ideas of God. So God, where are you? Why are you allowing babies to die? Why are these floods? And why are these things happening? As if God is some sort of a Wizard of Oz that's supposed to control everything in the world. So we kind of set up God, and we blame God for things that happen. Again, rather than seeing this as an opportunity for our growth, because that's what it is. God allows things to happen so that we can draw closer to him, so that we can say, pray for them, and also thank God for the blessings that we have, and see what we can do to help that person. That's what we're supposed to do, not say, God, how dare you? Because then we're judging God, and God forbid that we should be.
We don't want to go down that road. No, we don't want to go down that road. That's for sure.
And the last thing I would think, Father, is the scientific thing. The last thing I think makes it difficult for people is they expect God to conform to science. We have a lot of emphasis on science in our culture, and I think that's also an obstacle.
Okay. Let's go to one more question. I want to end this evening with my last question, which is going to be, why doesn't God just reveal himself to everyone rather than expecting us to just have faith and get it over with? But before we go there, let's go to see if we have any other questions from our guests tonight.
Yeah, we have a question next from John. If you want to unmute yourself, John.
Thank you, Noelle. And hi, Dr. Jeannie. Regards from
John.
Washington, D.C. Great to see you again. I'm doing great.
Did you have any flooding there? We
not
haven't
here.
Heard about D.C. Okay, good. Because we heard about New York, New Jersey. All right, that's good.
My mom's having a tough time in New York, but we're going to take care of that.
Oh, Lord have mercy.
But thank you for asking. So, Dr. Jeannie.
Go ahead.
Let me ask you, in your book, Thinking Orthodox, you write about the danger of creating unnecessary doubt.
Yes.
So how do we encounter doubt with a sense of orthodox phronima? And what can we do to ensure that we do not generate excess doubt in our own hearts and in those of our loved ones and our neighbors?
Good question, John.
That's a good question. So creating unnecessary doubt. First of all, we have to recognize that sometimes that was, I think, directed to theologians, that sometimes we know a lot. So we try to share that with people, sometimes, in a good spirit, very enthusiastically, and then we find people are sometimes a very simple faith are unable to absorb that. And then they become doubtful. So we have to be careful about that. How can we avoid it? We have to know, that's really more for theologians, that comment. We have to know who our audience is, who we're talking to, whether or not they're capable of understanding what we're saying, and at the right, at the level that in the manner in which we mean it. Because I'm sure you've had this experience, John, and everybody, that we're misunderstood. sometimes with what we say. So sometimes people are not capable of hearing our words. Okay, so, and sometimes we intend something to be good, but rather than giving somebody some kind of courage, it just makes them more doubtful. So I'm not sure, John, whether or not that answering your question, how can we avoid it? We have to be more sensitive, I would say, to the fact that other people don't think as we are. Other people are not sometimes at, I don't want to say level as though we are, you know, something special, but people are at different places in their journey. So
yes,
what we want to do is find out what is the issue in their life and then try to help them with that if we can, rather than just telling them what we think they need to know. So you see what I'm saying?
I do. In other words, to be cognizant of whom we're speaking with, whom we're communicating these issues with. Okay, thank you, Dr.
Right,
G.
and that's why I'm so opposed to the just bulletin board on the internet, just answer questions, because you don't know the person who's reading that, how they receive it. They might say, oh my God, I have no hope of being saved. I might as well end it. We never know. So we have to be very, very careful. And that's why it's not good to have blanket statements. And anyhow, well, I had one of my students ask me a question. Somebody asked me a question and it was like, just like, where did I ever say that? Like they completely misunderstood, you know, what I was saying. That can happen.
My grandfather, who had a third grade education from Thraiki, when he came over, he said, and I'll say it in English, he says, you know, Cristo, he says, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Yeah. God did that purposely. So you listen more and speak a lot less. So we have to listen and learn where people are from before we're out there. Now, it's very difficult today. Anyone in a leadership position today is in real trouble because you cannot be a leader to every single person. You're going to upset somebody along the way. That's going to happen.
Right. That's right.
So, and that can create doubt. That can create.
We have to be careful with what we say, especially, for example, from the pulpit. You know, what my cousin was in church and he said, you know, the priest here, it was in some other church, the priest is like, just it's such a low level of what he's saying. I said, yeah, but he has to talk to the congregation. He can't say things that are, you know, over their heads or something maybe that they can't understand. You talk about your grandfather. My mother was a very pious person, but very, very simple in her faith. So, you know, when I started talking to her about Genesis and Adam and Eve and that, you know, things were created in 6 days, that kind of a thing, she got very disturbed by that. So I had to, this was my first, you know, sort of lesson, and I was in college at the time, that some people cannot accept those stories in any other way other than the most literal, the most basic. And if that's where they are, leave them alone.
Leave them alone. Okay? Yeah.
And if if they're other people who are really ready to understand it on a deeper level, fine, go have the conversation with them. But for the person who can't understand those things on that level, then you really risk harming them spiritually.
You know, there's a sentence here from Olga. She says, one of my blessed quotes regarding hypocrisy, one of my beloved quotes regarding hypocrisy: it is better to be hated for what you are than to be loved for what you are not.
Yes.
Wow.
And how about it's better to be hated by the world and loved by God.
Yeah.
Okay. Because
so the final question. Why doesn't God just reveal himself to everyone rather than expecting us to have this faith so that we can get rid of this doubt issue?
Because he wants us to love him. And love can only happen when we believe and when we have this, when we choose. Love is only love when we choose to love, right? That's a free will decision. So if he revealed himself and said, this is who I am, then people would not have any choice. They would have to believe in God because it was obvious. But he wants us to come to him with love, not because of force. And a powerful example that he is who he says he is, so everybody make it obvious, then we would have no choice. And then we wouldn't love him. That's really, it's as simple as that.
All right. Well, listen, Dr. Ginny, again, thank you so much for these 2 sessions on doubt. I'm sure we'll have you back on the program. There are many, many people who really enjoy listening to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Father. Thank you, Father. Good night, everybody.
Lord, now let your servant depart in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared for all people, and the glory of your people, Israel. Thanks, everyone.